Alright, juniors, welcome to one of these things. Alright, War in the Pacific. If you look at the map here, this generally looks at the expansion of Japan throughout the 1940s. And thus then the war becomes efforts to halt the spread of the Japanese army and then really push them back. When it comes to, so we've already mentioned what Japan is doing. When it comes to the United States involvement, it begins militarily with, as we've said before, the battle or bombing of Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor, December 7th on 1941. After that, the U.S. starts a campaign to push back the Japanese army. And they do this by what's known as island hopping. Since the Japanese, if you look at the map, they are spread out over an enormous amount of territory, thousands and thousands of miles north and east and west. So the U.S., the tactic that they employ, along with allies, namely the Australians, is island hopping. They're going to retake not every single island, but if they hop from one island to another, they cut off the island in between those. So if they can disrupt the supply line from all these islands, then the islands that they don't even attack, they will run out of supplies, both military supplies as well as food and other things. So, it's not an easy task, namely because the Japanese army is very well trained and they have very good military equipment, and the fact that Japanese are fierce fighters. So, the Battle of the Pacific takes a rather long amount of time and results in massive death tolls. Military-wise, Americans and allies lose about 4 million people, and death tolls, including the Chinese and other people, is about 25 million, whereas the Japanese lose about 2 million people and about 1 million civilians. So for about 4 years, the Battle in the Pacific rages on, and utilizes a great deal of aircraft carriers. Since it's happening in the sea, the need to get air support for troops fighting on the ground, or even weaken the Japanese defenses before troops even get on the ground, is the need for aircraft. So there's a number of these aircraft carriers that are sailing out through the Pacific, essentially acting as mobile floating bases and airstrips. So as the U.S. continues, there's a great deal of battles. You start seeing tactics employed by the Japanese of Kamikaze, where aircraft are just flying straight into American ships. But as the U.S. advances, they start making some territory. One of the biggest turning points is the battle in the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, where the United States are able to sink a number of Japanese carriers and continue hopping, and namely they take control of what's known as Midway Atoll. So this right here is a Japanese ship that has been destroyed, and once the ships and accompanying things are destroyed, then the United States goes island, have to send troops onto the islands. The islands themselves are fiercely guarded and fought for, and they're in the Pacific, so rather thick tropical forests, which is why we have enormous death tolls in the Pacific for American troops that are trying to get the Japanese out of these islands. Where this goes to, though, one of the biggest turning points ends up being this island here, you can see south of Japan, called Iwo Jima. Now, the Japanese, they have offenses in India. They're in the Philippines. Once the Philippines are lost, then if you look in the south, the Philippines are in that southwest corner of this map here. Once the Philippines are taken over by a combination of Americans and Australians, then they start moving north toward Japan. And Iwo Jima is one of the hardest fought battles in the war. There are underground tunnels all through the island, which makes fighting rather difficult. But once the United States troops are able to attack, and this image here is quite famous, called the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima, then really the next step is getting to Japan itself. The battle itself, over 6,000 American Marines are killed, whereas the Japanese lose 20,000 soldiers on Iwo Jima. Now, as the war in the Pacific is going on, what starts to be fairly obvious to Americans and other troops as they continue is the treatment of troops by the Japanese. So POWs are prisoners of war. And under the rules of war, they're established by what's known as the Geneva Conventions. And Geneva Conventions are really designed to, even though war is known to happen, to at least have decent treatment of soldiers and civilians. Now, this does not happen. You can see here that the Americans and other prisoners of war, they're not treated very well by the Japanese. Namely, they're starved, and that they are even worse, publicly beheaded. This is a famous image of a Australian POW about to be beheaded by the Japanese. They're even used as target practice. So in the face of so many brutalities, really the Germans killed only 800 American soldiers in their concentration camps, whereas the Japanese killed over 1,500. So seeing this, the treatment of Americans throughout the war, and that really the fierce fighting of the Japanese, and this idea that they're not going to allow Americans to invade Japan itself without massive casualties, then it becomes the question of how are we going to end this war. And the United States makes the decision to use newfound technology, which is the atomic bomb. So on February 3rd, 1945, Soviets agree to enter into the war with the United States and start attacking Manchuria. And on August 6, 1945, a plane called the Enola Gay drops the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. A few days later, 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And the effect of the atomic bombs are, well, fairly disastrous for the Japanese. Combined, these two bombs, they kill 129,000 people. They completely level the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and really shock the Japanese as to their power. They're so powerful that in some cases you have, like in this image, the shadows of people burned into the walls that they were standing next to because of the intense heat generated by the atomic bombs themselves. After the atomic bombs are dropped, Japan surrenders. So August 15th, So just 6 days later, Japan surrenders, and World War II is over. We're going to talk a bit about whether these bombs should have been dropped in class and have a bit of a debate. But August 15th, 1945, really World War II comes to an end.